Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Yuval Levin. Yuval is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he also holds a chair in public policy. He's the founder and editor of National Affairs. He's a senior editor at the New Atlantis, a contributing editor at the National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. He has his master's and PhD on social thought at the University of Chicago. He's previously served as a member of the White House domestic policy staff under George W. Bush. He was also executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics and a congressional staffer at the member committee and leadership levels. He is widely on radio and TV and published essays and articles in the aforementioned locations. He's the author of several books, including probably his biggest one, which is A Time to Build. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. I've wanted to talk to Yuval for a long time, and I was very glad that he was able to get on the podcast, and we talked about the book, mostly A Time to Build. The biggest reason why I wanted to talk to Yuval was because him and I share a very strong commitment and agreement on reforming institutions in the United States. That's something that I feel very strongly about. It's something that we need to do, and a lot of burning it down and tearing it down and restarting and all these things is not very appealing for me, although I get the sentiment. And I think the harder task and the harder project is, how do we reform institutions? How do we rebuild in some ways? And so I really appreciate his temperament and his thoughts on this. We talk about why rebuilding institutions is important. We talk about generally why institutions are important. We talk about individuals and institutions and the difference there, slow change within institutions, and why folks mistrust and dislike institutions, in more recent years. We make the case for elites, which is an interesting position there. We talk about building broad political coalitions. At the time when we recorded this, President Trump's first 100 days had just finished. It's been a few time past that now, but I think the piece of it will still be relevant. Reforming journalism and the institution of family in the 21st century, and many other topics. Again, Yuval was wonderful. I was very, very happy to talk with him after wanting to for a couple of years. And I think we had, I think almost complete agreement on most of the stuff in the conversation. So we do care about reforming institutions. So he's going to continue that project and with his work and what he's doing. And I'll do my little piece over here on the podcast and certain conversations. So it was great to get his voice here. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So please subscribe to the Substack and share with your friends. And now I bring you Yuval Levin. I am here with Yuval Levin. Yuval, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I am greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, no, for sure. I have followed your work. I've read at least one of your books twice. And there's much to talk about. The book is A Time to Build. This is the one that I've read. This isn't your first book. You've written other books as well, yeah?
Yeah, that was number 4. I've since had another one last year, too.
Oh, very nice, very nice. Yeah, Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. I am, as some listeners will know, a kind of a pragmatic institutionalist. I think we need good institutions, and we'll talk about that, and why we need a good sense of pragmatism there. So we're going to get all into it. Before we do, why don't you just tell listeners a snapshot of kind of who you are, all the relevant details.
Well, I'm a recovering political scientist. I work in Washington at a think tank called the American Enterprise Institute. which is a right of center place that tries to think about public policy in a serious way. I worked in government for a long time. I worked as a White House staffer for George W. Bush and was a congressional staffer. I'm a kind of academic. I have a PhD from the University of Chicago. And my work has moved over the years from a focus on concrete public policy, things like healthcare and federal budget issues, to thinking more and more about why those kinds of policy debates actually aren't happening now in Washington,
Mm,
and why we're living in a kind of broken political culture that doesn't allow us to solve problems. And that's how I ended up thinking about institutions.
mm. Well, this is always a lot of fun. So I'm most people know left of center. So I'm a moderate liberal. So we're going to see where our paths converge here. Of
Yeah.
course, but yeah, I found. I mean, almost not that I'm looking for it, but little to disagree with in your book, A Time to Build, and other things I've read. So I think we just have so much overlap. So let's start with the big thing here. um, why is reforming institutions one of the most important things for the moment? I guess more specifically, we've seen this decline of our institutions, and we've gone from local to like national politics 24/7 all the time. What are some important factors here, right? How do we there's how do we reform big institutions kind of at the national level, but also kind of in the local areas as well where things are built? What's the big 30,000-foot view here to get us started on why reforming institutions is important?
I think in a way the place to begin is with the fact that the decline of institutions throughout American life is at the center of the peculiar sort of social crisis that we've been living in 21st century America. It's a crisis that's taken a lot of different kinds of forms. In our politics, it tends to look like intense polarization and dysfunctional governing institutions. In the culture, often it looks like alienation and anger. On college campuses, it can feel like an environment of exclusion and defensiveness rather than openness and inquiry. In the personal lives of a lot of Americans, it takes the form of isolation and despair, with rising suicide rates and opioid abuse. These are problems that seem like they're somehow connected, but they're not obviously connected. And there's not a shortage of explanations for each of them. You can say
Mm,
this is caused by that and that's caused by this, but why is it all happening at the same time?
mm,
I think a big part of why it's happening at the same time is that the means by which we connect with each other and act together are breaking down. And those are our institutions. Institutions are just the modes of collective action. They're the forms and structures of what we do together as Americans. And a lot of the time we can treat them as invisible. When they're working well, we don't have to think about them. And so we can feel really free, even though we're constantly defined and constrained by institutions. When they're not working well, we really need a language for them. We need to be able to see what's breaking down. And part of what I try to do in the book you mentioned is to provide a little bit of a language for that so that we can see that this isn't just about partisanship in politics. It isn't just about opioid abuse. Those things are connected because the ways in which Americans can belong to something, can act together, can see themselves as part of something larger, those are what's breaking down. And those are institutions all the way from family and community up to the governing institutions at the national level. There's something about the way we approach them, the way that we trust or mistrust them, the way we define ourselves through them that's broken down. And that means that to solve these problems, we have to somehow reform our institutions to make them more trustworthy. We often think of institutions in terms of trust. I think we should think about them in terms of trustworthiness. The problem is not that we don't trust them. The problem is that they're not trustworthy. And that
mm,
means they need to change even as we need to change. It's very hard for us as Americans to see problems in those terms. And I think this is a moment that requires it.
mm. I guess make the case a little bit for institutions in and of itself.
Yeah.
Let me pull this apart for you for a minute. So you talk about this, that if you have a missing structure in social life, it prevents us from having shape, place, and purpose together. I can hear many people on the far right and some of my libertarian friends, is we don't need all these things. We're just going to DIY it. We're going to do it ourselves. And you see this in different how this is broken up in different ways in our society now. We can talk about this, but you see this in journalism. You see this, the family is splintered through, because people can be in different parts of the world now. You see this obviously in our politics and how partisan it is, and even though people just don't have an appetite for, or seemingly for institutions. Why do I need a federal? Why do we need a Federal Reserve? Why do we need the New York Times and the Washington Post? Why do we need, if you're a spiritual person, why can't we just do church our way, or whatever your religious faith is? And there's this kind of outsourcing of it, or wanting to say the idea of institutions is that other. It's that thing. It just holds me back. It gives me constraints. It doesn't allow me to be have liberty and freedom and all these sort of the libertarian argument. I guess what is the case generally? We can talk more specifics about not only why do we need institutions, but how they're instructive for
Yeah.
our everyday life, for culture through time, for us as Americans.
Yeah, I think that attitude that institutions are fundamentally just constraints is very natural to us. It's natural to people who live in a free society. It's especially natural to Americans. Our culture is rooted in a certain kind of dissenting Protestantism that mistrusts mediation, that
Hmm.
that identifies directness with legitimacy and authenticity. And so we don't want anything standing between us and what we're doing. We don't want to believe that we need institutional formation. But I would answer that by really focusing on that word formation. What institutions do for us is that they form us to be capable of doing what we do in the world. Human beings don't start out being able citizens or professionals. We don't start out being journalists or physicians, right? We become those things by learning something. And what we learn is not just information, but also a way of being in the world. And that's what institutions do for us. They are the structures of our experience. And what that means is that they give individuals roles in the world in relation to one another and in relation to something they're doing together. So, an institution, take a school. A
Hmm.
school says to a group of people, you're a student, you're a teacher, you're a principal, you're a parent. You each have a role in relation to one another and in relation to what we're doing here together, which is educating the rising generation. And having that role is constraining, right? There are things a teacher is not allowed to do, but it's also empowering. There are things that only a teacher is allowed to do. And our lives are just full of these kinds of roles. Institutions all over the place give us roles to play that both restrain and empower us. And so we can say, well, I'm this person's father. I have some authority over them, over what happens to them. But you can also say, well, I'm this person's father. There are things that I just shouldn't be doing because I have that responsibility in the world. And over, being formed in these ways by institutions allows us to be more than just loose individuals, allows us to be playing a part in the life of our society and in one another's lives that we could not play without these institutions. The idea that we could do it all without structure is just not right. It's a kind of libertarian illusion, which we can only believe because we take functional institutions for granted. And
Mm.
so, without the institutions that allow us to have a functional free society, the rule of law, a market system, a lot of trust to believe that I'm going to pay you now and you're going to send me something later, that's a social achievement. That is
Mhm.
not something that happens naturally. And it's a social achievement made possible by functional institutions. And so, I think a lot of what happens when we dismiss the need for institutions is a taking for granted of functional institutions. And when we take them for granted, we can't see them when they break down. And so we can't see that they are what needs fixing. So to me, the case for institutions ultimately begins with a kind of anthropology. And
Mm.
and maybe this is a conservative argument for it, but I think human beings start out unready. We start out fallen, broken, prone to vice, to sin, take your vocabulary as you want it. And in order to be capable of being free people, we need to be formed
Mm,
toward freedom. The family does that first and foremost. Maybe a religion does it for you. Maybe your community does it. Maybe a school does, or a workplace. They form us to be capable of functioning in the world. And without that formation, we would not be capable of functioning in the world. And what you see when institutions break down is people becoming less capable.
mm, mm. Yeah, this is the sort of the true conservative argument, I guess. Kind of this Burkean kind of
Yeah.
undercurrent there, which is great. I'm sympathetic. I guess the one question I have here on the institutions is this is sort of a specific question here, but institutions are made. I mean, not all necessarily, but many are made or definitely inhabited by individuals and by a collective of individuals. And so but there's this kind of twofold thing happening at once that institutions are they become an entity, but they always have people that are inhabiting them, and they can be flawed, and they can break down, and they can be dysfunctional. Um, but how do we make that delineation between maybe there's some bad actors, or maybe there's it's not a healthy institution because of the individuals, or is it, in some cases, some people would say, well, you just tear the whole institution down because the whole thing is the entity, the idea of the institution is just not right. And I guess this is sort of the reformist argument is, well, not that you just clear everybody out, but how do you have, make some changes, or you erect some scaffolding to make a kind of reconstruction? I guess, how do we look at that relationship between sort of the position of that people can hold, like, an institution or a positional thing like a teacher or a politician or something, is it's the person in it, but it's also the bigger thing of you're in a movable position, and the position is greater than the individual, but there's this relationship that kind of can transform institutions over time. Talk about that kind of sort of dichotomy of sorts.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a constant challenge. So,
Yeah.
institutions at one level are really just an institution is just a bunch of people, right? But it's not simply a bunch of people because it's a bunch of people organized around a purpose,
Yeah.
oriented by an ideal, by a goal. And that means that as an institution, what they do together is accountable to that purpose, to that ideal, to that goal. You can ask, is it really achieving that purpose? Is the school really educating those children? Are we really doing what we say we're doing? And that is a way of holding the individuals accountable and the institutions accountable. And it's essential to have it because every everything human is prone to corruption. And so, without question, institutions are prone to corruption. They're more prone to corruption than individuals because they have more power than individuals, and
Mm,
power corrupts. That means that there has to be a way to hold them accountable, to make demands of them, as well as to allow them to exercise power or to defer to them.
mm,
And when institutions do become corrupt, the question is, do we abandon them and throw them away, or do we find some ways to reform and fix them?
mm,
There's not one answer to that. It's going to vary from place to place, but I am certainly inclined to a view that says that institutions that have worked well over time deserve at least an attempt at reform. We
mm,
shouldn't begin by saying, well, let's throw it away, because we shouldn't assume that we could do better from scratch. It's unlikely. Institutions are built up over generations. They slowly evolve around our needs and our strengths and weaknesses, and that means that they contain more knowledge than we're likely to have.
mm,
So if you just throw it out, you take the Republican Party, which is, I think, a broken institution. Do we just
mm,
throw it out? Well, not necessarily. I don't
mm,
know what would happen then. And I'm not sure that we could start from scratch today and build something better. And so the question is, how can we fix it in the direction of its improvement, in the direction of its serving its purpose? Now, it's not always possible. Some institutions are so corrupt that they can't be fixed.
mm,
But I do think that that's rare. and that at least we should try where we can to fix those institutions that can be reformed and addressed. Now, sometimes you do that by creating competition for them, by subjecting them to pressures, not necessarily economic competition, but in some kind of marketplace where people can choose from among different options. And you want to create pressure for them to become more attractive and better. That can happen to a political party, for example, if it loses elections. It can happen to a business as it loses customers. Some institutions you can't really treat that way. Congress is broken. I can't just create another Congress to compete with it. And so I have to find ways to fix it from within the framework of what it is today. But I think looking for ways to take seriously the stated purpose and goal of an institution and say, how could it serve this better, is the way to respond to the failure of an institution that matters to us and has some important place in our lives. And so we shouldn't be too quick to burn things down. We should look for ways to build things up. I think, generally speaking, it's dangerous to overestimate the benefit we could achieve by throwing things away, because we tend to underestimate what we need, and therefore we'll end up with nothing if we burn down what we have. That's not a way to improve things. That's a way to regress.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm gonna kind of push a little here on your sensibilities of it. Uh, I find that institutions are always moving; they're not static, and they need to evolve, right? So you could take something like, you know, again, I love the U.S. Constitution. However, we should update, right? And we have in certain things, but we do need to update things. We do have things in our Federal Reserve. We have things in our, in how we do our systems of government, and of course in other types of institutions. We do have to update as we move. Other countries do it around the world. We're in, quarter of the 21st century is done. There are things we have, and sometimes people, I think rightfully so, kind of resist maybe some of that. I think definitely where you and I will agree, maybe we might, split hairs a little bit, but certainly as I've gotten older, I have been more for um, a little bit slower in terms of how we change and reform institutions. We should, but it should not be, this, you can have the grand idealistic kind of, vision. That's important. But in terms of the nuts and bolts of it, because I find, I mean, you tell me what you think about this. If you, even if the change is right, or even if it makes the most sense, or even if you push that too much too fast on people, they resist it, and they don't like it. And you have to really, you sort of kind of pull people sometimes, drag them. Some people are already ahead of you. But I think generally, if you have a very big, diverse, multicultural country of 340, 50 million people, you can't expect to just, okay, we got to reform the institutions. Yes, we don't burn it down. Well, let's completely change it to a certain way we want to do it. It's a kind of sweet spot. What do you think about this kind of idea?
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think the question when it comes to social change or institutional change is not whether, but how. And to my mind, the answer to how, generally speaking, ought to be incrementally. And the reason for that is exactly what you say, which is people react to sudden change defensively, and therefore find it hard to see the need for change when you push them too fast, and to see the appeal of change when you force it on them. And so, ideally, with reasonably functional institutions, change should happen gradually and incrementally in response to needs. It should also happen experimentally. We don't know in advance exactly what we should be doing. And so we should try and learn from mistakes and learn from successes too. That's much easier said than done, obviously. And, you mentioned the Constitution. I think if you look at the pattern of constitutional amendment in the United States, what often happens is that frustrations build up and ideas emerge for how to deal with them. And then it takes time for majority support to build up around those ideas, and then change happens. And so we had the Bill of Rights at the end of the 18th century. A couple of small amendments followed at the beginning of the 19th, and then there's a 50-year period without constitutional amendments until after the Civil War. Then there's another 50-year period without constitutional amendments until the early progressive era.
Mm.
And there's been another 50-year period since the 1970s now without any constitutional amendments. And in those periods, frustrations mount. People propose ideas, other people criticize them. Gradually, some consensus can build up around changes that might be widely supportable. And, in the moment we're living in now, it's really hard to imagine how there could ever be enough of a majority for anything to change the Constitution. But I think there will be. It's going to take time for us to get out of the 50-50 moment that we're in. But our system is built to facilitate the transformation of frustration into incremental action. And I do think it's still capable of that. Effective institutions can sometimes do that. It's not always possible to change that way. Sometimes things break down, and there's really a moment of crisis, and you really have to do a lot of changing and rebuilding all at once. That's best avoided, but it can't always be avoided, and we have to be prepared for that possibility too. But I think institutions facilitate change by the fact that they resist it, by changing gradually, by changing incrementally, by insisting on some continuity between the past and the present and the future. And in that sense, they're healthy agents of social change rather than restrictions and restraints on it when they're healthy. When they're not, they can be obstacles to constructive change in ways that lead people to lose trust in them, as we have seen, that lead people to become very frustrated with them, and ultimately that can lead people to attack and assault them too.
Yeah, an example I think of is immigration. While it's not quite an institution specifically, our current immigration laws are from, really '86. So it's 40 years. There was the H.W. Bush bill in 91, 92. I don't remember when it was, but it was 91, I guess. But yeah, our immigration laws are at least 35 years old, 35, 40 years old, and that's just a problem. How much the world has grown and exploded, and definitely how the U.S. has in 35, 40 years. And it's such a frustrating thing because I actually sort of trend a bit, center right conservative on immigration, to some people's surprise. And really, I think I just see. I've talked about this before publicly. I just see immigration as one side of the coin, and the other side is a healthy sense of nationalism, a sense of identity. And this is my point I was just making. Too much change, too fast, without at least some acculturation and certain kinds of buy-in to what generally the United States is. People push back against that, and they resent it. And I think that for me, we should do this very carefully. We should do this a little bit slowly. And so that kind of, for me, spells out policy-wise of like, yes, there should be some restraint. There should be, we should be a little bit more curated in how we think about this. Not to be unwelcoming, of course. My dad's an immigrant, all these things, but it's just one of those things where you have to be able to say, how can we let some things kind of breathe? How can we let things kind of, because what ends up happening is some of the things we see now. You see rising rhetoric on both sides. It's very extreme. People get angry. They start to other people. That's not good. And you need people to kind of, in some sense, settle. And I know people disagree with me on this, but I just think pragmatically, you have to be able to do this. And you can't do any of that if you're using immigration laws from the 80s. You need to update. Now it's a congressional issue, but there's things like that.
It's a congressional issue, but it speaks exactly to what we're talking about.
Right, right.
I think Congress is an example of an institution that has become dysfunctional in the sense that it no longer serves well the fundamental purpose that it has, which is facilitating bargaining and accommodation. Exactly the kind of gradual change, responsive but not overly assertive change that we're talking about here. If Congress is functional and represents the different factions of American views of this kind of question, the result would be a messy, complicated reform that nobody loves but everybody can live with. That's what we're missing when it comes to immigration. People have strong views of what they want. The question is, what can you accept? And that's the kind of question that, when it's functional, Congress exists to ask and answer. And in the absence of a functional national legislature, we find ourselves unable to move incrementally, and therefore, on the one hand, stuck legally in a place where we've been for 50 years. On the other hand, seeing dramatic changes on the ground with very high levels of illegal immigration that create the kinds of tensions you're talking about. And it would require a more functional Congress, institutionally functional, to be able to address this kind of problem. So institutional reform is necessary not only so that Congress becomes more popular or more trusted, but so that it can help us address exactly this kind of problem, and problems that make it hard for our other institutions to function too.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last immigration bill that passed, House or Senate, I can't remember which one, was 2013, 2014, had the Gang of Eight, our current Secretary of State Rubio, then
Right.
Senator was on that. And it passed one chamber, didn't pass the other, unfortunately. So, but that was, I mean, that's 12 years ago,
Right.
it's wild. So, okay, you talked about trust and trustworthiness. So there's a strong distrust of institutions now. And kind of what we've been talking about, I see institutions as this kind of, I see institutions as, in a sense, an act of discipline for society, right? If you think about being married, having a job, attending church, these are sort of pieces that can give you a lot of things, but they're also they give you some sense of consistency, some discipline. They're also a type of protective factor as well, which I think is important. So institutions for me are this necessary adhesive that our culture and society build throughout time. They're part of our history, as you were kind of saying, the anthropological piece. So if institutions connect us to the past, they provide protective factors that give us connectedness. Why the hell do people hate them and resist them and want to blow them up? I mean, not necessarily literally, you know what I mean, but they want to kind of tear them down and all these things. And I guess just to tack onto this, I mean, you must have. I'm curious what I'm a little fuzzy on the specifics, but Pete Buttigieg wrote a short book called Trust. I think it was after 2020 or something and he's making a lot of similar points, and he's maybe giving the kind of moderate, modern liberal version of some of these things. So I don't know if you have any how much daylight between you and him on this, or if you're familiar with it. But either way, why a lot of people are picking up on this distrust, or we don't trust, or his lack of trustworthiness in institutions. So even though it can give us, at least in theory, all of these things, why are people so distrusting? Why are they? Is it not an understanding of something? Is it that they failed them in some ways? Is it too much propaganda? What is the big thing for this distrust in institutions?
This dynamic of mistrust is, on the one hand, one of the most thoroughly demonstrated facts in contemporary social science. There's just a massive, endless mountain of public survey data that shows that Americans have been losing trust in institutions since about the middle of the 20th century, that loss of trust accelerated in the 21st century. And we see it all around us. We don't even need the public opinion surveys. But what exactly that means is not actually obvious in our public debate. What do we mean when we say we don't trust an institution? What do we mean when we do trust an institution? I think one thing we mean is we think the institution is competent. It does its job well. And so it says it's going to do this, and it does it. And some of our loss of trust is a function of a loss of the sense that our institutions are competent. So we've lived through, in the 21st century, failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, failures of the intelligence community. We've lived through a financial crisis. We've lived through the pandemic, and over we've seen professionals who don't seem as capable and competent as we would like. And yet I think that that's not enough of an explanation of the intense loss of trust that we've seen, because some degree of incapacity, inability is always with us. Another source of mistrust is something like corruption, is a sense that people in our institutions are self-serving. And that certainly happens now too, but that too is always present in any powerful institution. It's part of why we don't trust, but it's not, I think, ultimately the underlying source. I think what's been really distinct about institutional authority figures in the 21st century is something more like a lack of restraint.
Hmm.
And that's what you describe when you say part of what institutions do is they constrain us, is they protect us. Um, what it means to trust an institution is, in part, is to believe that it forms trustworthy people. Institutions form people. As I said before,
Right.
there's such a thing in the world as a professional, right? There's such a thing as a Marine, there's such a thing as a teacher, there's such a thing as a lawyer, a dentist. You run into somebody at a party, you talk to them for a while, and you're kind of thinking, I bet this person's an accountant. And you think that because there's such a thing in the world as somebody formed to be an accountant.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and a lot of what that means is not that this person's very good at math, but that there's certain things they wouldn't do,
Hmm.
right? A priest would not reveal what he hears in confession. A scientist doesn't just say stuff, but tries to prove it. And those are ways in which constraints create trustworthiness
So
because you
is
know that a professional is somebody who follows a certain code.
Yeah, I was going to say it's almost like there's an embedded ethical responsibility within the position or the institution. Yeah.
Exactly. And the
Hmm.
source of their power is that restraint
Uh-huh.
because you do listen to your doctor when he says something because you know that he's not just talking and he didn't just see this on the internet 5 minutes ago.
Right.
There's a reason why he or she believes this thing.
Mm.
And part of the pattern of the dysfunction of our institutions in the last 30 years or so has been a transformation of our sense that institutions are formative in this way. And instead, we've come to think of institutions as something more like performative, as a platform for people to stand on and be prominent and build a following and build a brand. And so people within our institutions use them less to be shaped and constrained in ways that empower them and more to be elevated in ways that make them more prominent. You see this in our politics all the time. People run for Congress in order to have a bigger social media following, a more prominent place in the kind of theater of our politics, and they don't spend a lot of their time legislating, which is a specific thing to do. They spend a lot of their time performing and communicating. And that's actually happened in different ways in a lot of our institutions. And we have the sense that this person who has this important job with a lot of authority in this big institution actually is just talking. That's all they're doing. And, the presidency becomes a big stage, Congress becomes a big stage, professional institutions just become platforms for personal brand building, for journalists, for scientists, for corporate executives. It's easy to exaggerate this, but it is really happening. And
Mm.
it contributes to a loss of trust because it leaves us thinking that the people we're hearing from really aren't speaking from a constrained place of authority. They're just speaking from a prominent position that allows them to be more visible.
Mm.
And as we've thought this way about institutions that we're part of, we make those institutions harder and harder to trust. Everything becomes a stage for the same kind of
Yeah.
political performance art. And what happens in a university just isn't that different from what happens in our politics, and isn't that different from what happens in the churches. It's all
Mm.
culture war. And
Yeah.
as it all becomes culture war, the individual institutions become harder to trust in their own domains. If we think that pastors and public health officials are all just playing politics, then we don't trust them in the domain where they exercise authority. I think that's had a lot to do with our contemporary loss of trust. And that means that what's required to push back against it is some rebuilding of constraint, which is not easy to do.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's a few things there. I mean, I think that obviously, social media and things like that, get some blame for this. I don't think all. I think the incentive structures are not great. Um, and I don't know. I mean, I totally agree with everything you're saying. I guess one question I have here is this idea of restraint or ethical responsibility or kind of respecting the position of the place that you hold, the role you fill is a little bit higher than yourself because it's not just you. It's there's a series of people that are there. Um, in some ways, there is an element, and I mean this. I know people use this as a pejorative, but I mean this in a kind of more positive way. There is an element of gatekeeping,
Yeah.
which is important. So I'm going to give you. This has sort of been in the kind of roaming around online at the moment, but I'm going to give you the hard task here. Give me the steel man, the argument to be made. What's the case to be made for elites, the educated elites? Why? How do we learn to rely on elites, but also push back on them as well? It's a kind of very, very push pull relationship, I think, um, and that there is a sort of consensus that you can have among elites. Not that everyone is this kind of groupthink. It's a tricky place there, but that we can agree that we should have a balanced federal budget. We should agree that we should have certain ideas about trade. We should have ideas about certain spending. All these things. Yeah, what's the case to be made for why we need elites?
Well, I think a free society has to have a balance between public power and elite authority. It needs both. And there are times when we have way too much elite power, and what we need
Sure.
is more democratic accountability. We've
Yeah.
had a lot of times like that in American life. There are also times when we have way too much popular power, and what we
Hmm.
need are more reliable elites. And we're
Mm.
living in such a time now. There always are elites.
Hmm.
We don't have the option of having none. Because in any kind of social arrangement, some people are going to rise to power and wealth. Some people are going to rise to positions of authority. You're going to have, and those people are the elite. By whatever form they rise, in whatever way they get there, they are the elite. There are always going to be elites. The challenge is, how do you have elites who serve the society's needs, and so are worthy of some degree of trust and authority? And at the heart of the answer to that are functional institutions that impose responsibilities on people with power. You can't have a society where nobody has power. That kind of dream is impossible. And the attempts to create it in the course of the 20th century resulted in the worst kinds of mass suffering
Yep.
and pain that we've
Yeah.
experienced in the history of our civilization.
Mm.
So that's not good. That's not going to happen. The question is, if we're going to have elites, how can we have effective and responsible and trustworthy elites? And I think, in a sense, what we're missing on that front is precisely a sense of restraint. We can't, the answer we offer now to the question of how do we have elites that belong there is something like absolute meritocracy, right? They have to prove that they belong there by some test
Mm.
of technical competence. You get into Stanford, and then you're on a path that leads you to the elite. Well, that's a very cold and kind of morally empty and irresponsible way to think about what elites are. It would be better if we thought about how elites prove themselves in terms of service to the public. That's what a lot of professions do for people. They create an ethos of responsibility where you do have a lot of power. Lawyers have a lot of power in our society.
Hmm.
But what is a lawyer? A lawyer is an agent of other people.
Hmm.
And properly understood, that's a profession that exists in the service of the larger society. Now, it's not always that way, and lawyers make more money than many other people, and so they're going to have certain kinds of advantages that other people don't have. But if the way in which we judge them is, are they serving the larger society, they're more likely to be useful to society as an elite. So I think the case for elites is they're going to be here. There's no way to avoid them. And so, how are we going to make them accountable, responsible, and trustworthy? Our society is doing a very bad job of answering that question right now.
Yeah, there's a few things there. I mean, I totally agree with you because when you're out in the world as an elite, you're representing a field, a discipline, things like that. I mean, this is true for me. I mean, I'm a clinical psychologist as my day job. I mean, and so when I walk out in the world, that doesn't turn off. in some ways, right? In the sense that people are going to see me. And yes, you're going to see me as a person, even if I'm quote unquote off duty. But you still, it's like the doctor that's on, the airplane or in the movie theater, whatever. You're always sort of, held to a little bit of higher standard because with responsibility, you're held to that, and you have to be responsible. I do think obviously people can have their personality come out and their difference and all these things, but the thing that binds people with lawyers or doctors or whatever, and I would say this even more broadly for politicians and journalists, and if you're in a position that's public facing, whether very overtly or somewhat kind of less publicly facing, but in the sense that you serve people, um, it's not just about you. It can't be just about you. And if you want to make it just about you, kind of what you're talking about, your platform, things like that, you probably shouldn't be there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Also, this
It's funny. You
idea,
can even see
yeah,
this in your personal life. If
yeah,
you're driving down the highway and somebody cuts you off and you want to yell out what you think about them, and you think, well, the kids are sitting in the back. I
right,
really
yeah,
shouldn't do that.
right,
That's a way of being formed by the fact that you're a parent to be a more restrained person.
right,
And
right,
we all experience this in some ways. We're all made
always,
better
yeah.
by various kinds of positions we have within institutions that really matter to us.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's just one of those things where it's like, how do you have, as someone that has the position of responsibility and ethical duty and all these things, a sense of epistemic humility, right? I'm going to get it wrong. I'm not always going to know. Yeah, you don't have to hedge. You can make, confident statements about things, but you have to also be able to say, I cannot just so willingly opine about anything because I have a title or a status behind my name or whatever it is. You have to know your lane of sorts. Depends on what it is, I guess, but it is, people don't have that, and that's like again a big problem. And I just think we're talking about this idea of restraint and responsibility and ethics and all these things. I, I want to be clear. I don't think you're saying or I'm saying that you can't still have elements of liberty and freedom in this in these sort of abstract ways. But I think it's the best, or not the best ways. I think one of the defining ways to have that is using this sort of restraint, because
Yeah.
otherwise, then you just have chaos, right? So if you really
Absolutely right.
want
I,
those
I,
things,
I,
you
I
have
do
to have
think
them.
it's important to see that the kinds of claims that we can make to knowledge and authority are constrained but real. And so you've learned something that puts you in a position to help people in particular circumstances. It doesn't mean you know everything, but it does mean you know that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think it's very important to see both sides of that coin because we tend to make both mistakes, to think
Hmm.
that somebody who's succeeded in business could also be a great governor. Well, maybe, but that
Yeah,
doesn't, it's not
right,
actually self-evident. Or,
right.
if you create a great company in Silicon Valley, are you also in a position to fix the Pentagon's budget? As we're now learning, maybe not.
Maybe not. Yeah.
It's not all the same kind of knowledge, but nonetheless, we should be willing to see that there is such a thing as knowledge. There is such a thing as genuine authority and as genuine trustworthiness. And both sides of that coin are hard for us. They're both
Hmm.
hard to keep in mind, exactly because institutions are such a wily category in a free society. It's very hard for us to wrap our heads around what it is that they empower us to do and what it is they constrain us from doing.
We've talked a little bit about politics. Let me just a few things here, and we can talk a little bit about journalism. Uh, I'm curious about this. I was talking about this with a friend of mine. I feel like politics moves too fast now, in a variety of ways. What do you think? What do you think are the chances that we get a broad popular coalition like the FDR New Dealers,
Mm.
the conservative counter revolution of Reagan, et cetera, where it's dominant but beyond one election cycle, right? And I guess you could maybe make the argument that, kind of MAGA movement is some version of that. I guess you can maybe make that argument. I don't know. But I feel like it's this thing of you win an election, let's talk about presidential election, let's say, immediately you got to give the red meat to your base. I don't know. It's a victory lap. It's weird. And we get these obnoxious executive orders and whatever. But it doesn't seem to hold as sort of a coalition. Even I think it was even Carter was still talking about I'm a New Dealer from the 30s. You're talking about 40 years of people talked about being a Reagan conservative up until 15 years ago. From the 80s. So I don't see that anymore. Why do you think that's still important? Do you think politics are just different now? How do you get a broad coalition, which is sort of a kind of political, institutional kind of thing beyond just, the next election cycle or whatever.
So it's a funny thing. I think in one sense you could say politics moves too fast. In another sense, I would say politics isn't moving at all.
That's fair.
We've been stuck in a 50-50 moment in American politics since about the end of the 1990s.
Yeah.
And it's worth seeing that that's actually very unusual. At almost any other time in American history, really any other time except the last couple of decades of the 19th century, if you'd looked in on American politics, you would see a majority party holding together a very complicated coalition and a minority party struggling to broaden its own coalition and cut into the other. And they're both engaged in coalition building, which means they're both trying to gain converts, not to hunt heretics. They're trying to persuade people who aren't already on board. And sometimes there's, once in a while, there's a transformative election, and the minority becomes the majority, and then it lasts for a while as a majority coalition. Since about 2000, we've had two minority parties at the same time in American political life. It's a very long time to be stuck in that dynamic, and it's not. What's distinct about it is not polarization. There's always some degree of polarization. We have a two-party system, so the parties hate each other. That's what they do. What's distinct about this moment is something more like deadlock, 50-50. Every election could go either way. Control of Congress has swung more back and forth in the last 25 years than in any other 25-year period in our history. Control of the presidency. We've just had control of the White House change parties 3 times in a row, which has only happened one other time in American history, again at the end of the 19th century. That's a dysfunctional dynamic in a two-party system, the absence of a majority. And it's led us to think that maybe we just can't have majorities anymore. I don't think that's right. I think that the dynamic of 50-50 has meant that our parties aren't trying to build broad coalitions. They're trying to win narrow elections. They're appealing to their most devoted voters, people who would never vote for the other party anyway, rather than appealing to winnable voters who might vote for either party. And they've been losing the knack for coalition building. That's the lost art in contemporary American politics. Coalition building means finding ways to patch together a majority by giving different factions, different groups, something of what they want in return for something of what you want. Neither of our parties really works this way now. The way they work is, let's get every last voter who's absolutely committed out, then we win 50% plus one, we claim it's a big mandate, and we do everything our activists ever wanted. As a result, we make ourselves unpopular, and then the other party does the same thing. That's the dynamic we're stuck in now. And I don't think that MAGA is an exception to that, actually. Donald Trump won 49.8% of the vote in the last election. That's the very definition of a 50-50 election. And he did the same thing, just as Biden did. He said, what a huge mandate this is. I'm going to go out and do everything that my activists have ever wanted. And he's making himself unpopular, so that by now his support is already in the low 40s. I don't think that is where we're stuck forever. But to get out of it will require some political talent and the imagination to see that it is possible to build majorities in our system by building coalitions, by reaching out and finding converts and allowing yourself to be less than pure in the eyes of your most devoted voters in return for winning more. That's how our system is meant to work. That's how the party system is supposed to work. And I think there, too, at the heart of it, is an institutional failure, a failure of the political parties. The commitment to the primary system, which is how both parties choose candidates now, means that those intensely devoted activists are the people who decide who populates our politics. And they're the people who least want bargaining, who least want accommodation, who least want coalition building. So we start every election cycle by asking the people who least want the system to work who should be in the system.
Yeah.
And then it doesn't work.
Yeah.
That needs to change. And for it to change, the parties would have to see that they're failing. The weird thing about this dynamic is that neither party can see that it's failing, that it's not, what it's doing isn't working. They both think, well, we'll just do it again next time and then we'll win. And the fact is, neither one of them has really won in an entire generation by playing this game.
I totally agree with you on that, and it baffles me of why we cater to the loudest voices but smallest minority of activists in each party. I don't understand. I mean, I think you obviously had the coalition with Reagan, a little bit with Clinton, I guess.
Clinton had a coalition.
The third way, you know. I think,
but notice something about Reagan
it.
and Clinton, and you can see this about FDR too. These are people who know what they sound like to people who don't agree with them. Right? Ronald Reagan is a Republican in Hollywood his entire life. Bill Clinton is a liberal in Arkansas. FDR is a kind of economic progressive in the wealthiest WASP segment of American life. They're people who don't belong in a way, and who therefore know that not everybody in the room is going to nod their head in agreement when they talk. There are not a lot of people like that in our politics right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I hadn't seen it that way. Yeah, and there is not a lot of people like that in our politics right now. It's tough. Let me just ask real quick, I guess, as maybe a small footnote here. I think we're just about to cross, 100 days of Trump's second, the sequel of Trump. Yeah, I mean, they're trying to do something with institutions, break them. It seems like. You don't have to necessarily opine on them specifically if you don't want to, but yeah, what do you think about?
No, look, I think what we're seeing is a peculiar experiment in which the insiders in our system understand themselves as outsiders. And so you have people who have a very hostile attitude toward the institutions that they have been empowered to run. That's true of the president himself, who very much sees himself as an outsider, even though his job is the most insider job there is in American politics. It's true of a lot of the people he's appointed. He's taken people who are critics, in some cases legitimate critics, of the institutions that they're in charge of, and put them in charge. So if you have some legitimate complaint about the Defense Department being too woke, you're now Secretary of Defense. Well, that it's a little too woke here and there, that's surely right. But that is not enough to give you the capacity and the credibility to run that entire institution. If you have some complaints about public health, that doesn't actually qualify you to be Secretary of HHS. And so over and over, we see people who are fundamentally dispositional outsiders put in the position of running institutions. And it's an experiment. I think that, there may be some changes they advance that are valuable in the long run. I think it's going to do a lot of harm, though. In a funny way, in a populist moment, the people who we need most are actually people who are comfortable being insiders, who are willing to reform, but see themselves as bearing the responsibility to actually run the institution. And I think that there is a real shortage of that evident in these 100 days, and you pay a price for it.
You must know Chris Liddell. I had a conversation with him talking about the fifth year and all that, and just talking about presidential transitions, which are super important. And it was such a great conversation because, and people that haven't listened, I highly encourage you to go and listen to my conversation with him. I mean, he really just kind of laid out what it takes to just fill basic government. And it's you just need people that do that to just make things run. And it's a whole machine to do it. And it's like, well, why do we need to do all that? It's like, well, you have we're the third largest country in the world, right? It's like third, fourth, whatever it is, country in the world. By land mass, by population, we have the biggest economy, biggest defense, someone's got to run it. You can't just have a bunch of people doing, 50, plus or minus 8 or 9 different ways of doing it. You gotta have some way that's, and you can debate about, how big or small government is. That's fine, but you do have to have something that is functional. And when you just lay it out, all the things you have to fill, it's a lot. It's a labyrinth, and so it's to your point, we just
Yeah.
need people to do some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, look, critique of powerful institutions is absolutely essential, but
Hmm.
it is not sufficient for
Hmm.
running those institutions.
Yeah,
And yeah, I think we're learning that the hard way at this point.
we certainly are. So, real quick here, a few things. Journalism. We could spend hours on this. You talked about this already, so but people use these things, these platforms, or excuse me, institutions as a platform, and I just think a lot of that is the incentive structures are really terrible,
Yeah.
for monetary or status wise or whatever. But I feel like a lot of the lack of trust in journalistic outlets is everyone can do a Google search. Everyone can watch a YouTube video. Everyone can, listen to a podcast or whatever. And everyone's got the substackification of everyone's got a Substack, um, which, again, listen, I have a podcast and I have a Substack, right? So I'm not saying these things are bad, but what I'm saying is that we can't keep. We need a New York Times, a Washington Post, Alexander, and other newspapers, but people that went to school for journalism, how to do it, just doing some, going down a rabbit hole or just turning on the mics and just riffing is not journalism. Like, and we need actual journalists. We need people that actually do this. We need these institutions. We can't substack our way out of this. How do we reclaim that? Because everyone thinks that, oh, New York Times is absolute bullshit. I'm not reading that again. Blah blah blah. Blah. Wall Street Journal is just absolutely craven to whatever. And look, I'm not saying that doesn't happen sometimes, or people, again, the incentive structures with legacy media, but that is, I don't know if that's as difficult as politics, but in terms of institution, that's a tough one to rebuild. That is a tough one. What are your thoughts on
Yeah,
this?
I agree with that. Journalism doesn't rise naturally. Professional journalism is the exception, not the rule.
Mm,
Our media environment is more like it was in the beginning of the American Republic than like it was in the 20th century. It's messy, it's partisan, it's untrustworthy, and the achievement of professional journalism is really a function of a lot of hard institution building in the
mm,
course of the 19th and 20th centuries in response to public need. And there, I think the incentives are really crucial. Right now,
mm.
the financial incentives all push against professional journalism.
Yeah. Yeah.
The way to thrive in this environment is to build a personal brand,
Yep.
and a personal brand is roughly the opposite of an institution. And so I think that a lot of journalists who have built up some cachet inside institutions as reasonably well-known reporters at the New York Times or Washington Post,
Yeah.
then have an enormous incentive to go out and become their own individual personal brands,
Hmm.
and undermine the institutional brand that they use to elevate themselves. And it's hard to blame them because the financial incentives are so strong in that direction right now.
Sure. Yeah.
The economics of journalism has moved from build the largest possible audience, which argues for broadly appealing and broadly reliable kinds of mass journalism, to build the most intensely engaged possible audience, which argues for much more narrowcasting, much more political silos, much more partisanship. And I don't have an answer to that. I don't see how the
Mm,
economics of journalism can sustain a New York Times or maybe
hmm.
one New York Times can be sustained, but a real ecosystem of professional journalism, I don't think anybody's found the formula for sustaining that in the 21st century. And without the right economic incentives, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen.
And I think it's hard because even now more than ever, much of the time what we're doing with information is just trying to distill it, because we have so much and we have so much access and we're getting hit with it all the time.
Hmm.
You need to distill it. You need to kind of filter it through and get the essence of it. And I mean, there's still great journalists out there, but I
Yeah.
agree, it is incentives are all wrong. It's upside down, and I don't know what the fix is there, but I certainly believe in the institution of honest, good, rigorous, ethical journalism. So one final quick thing here, just briefly. Family, very interesting. The family is obviously an institution, but we see people don't get married. They get married later in life. They're not having kids, low fertility rates. And this is sort of a global thing, not just an
Hmm.
American thing. Um, I guess for you, how do is and I'm not trying to get too out there with kind of social cultural kinds of things, but how do we embrace all types of family? I think when people think of the institution of family, they just take the traditional kind of way of doing things, which is totally fine. I have nothing against that. I think that's great. But how do we have that a traditional family model, but also alternative models where we can say, okay, how do in the 21st century, as we're dealing with all of these types of issues, the idea of family, the institution of family should stay. It should be there. But how do we have a wider net or broader spectrum of what that kind of looks like?
Well, I think there has to be some clear sense of why we need family. And the answer to that really is about formation. Family
Hmm.
is the place where the most unformed and most in need of formation human beings emerge. And
Yeah.
that means that we need family to help turn those unformed newborns into potential, citizens and reliable, responsible men and women.
Mhm.
That's the role that family has in our lives. And that means that the form of family matters a lot because it is formative. It doesn't mean there's exactly one kind of family structure that is the only one that can possibly achieve this goal. But I do think that there has to be some sense of a norm in the middle, and then of using that norm to build out some exceptions
Mm.
and some differences around it. I think it makes sense to have a kind of normative view of the basic traditional two-parent family, as long as we don't have the expectation that that's going to be possible for everyone or desirable for everyone.
Sure.
It isn't.
Yeah.
That's just the reality. That's always a reality. And of course, in some ways, it's more so now than it's tended to be. I don't think that's an argument against seeing the traditional family as a norm. And I think it's very important for us to recognize that the family is formative, not expressive. It's not a way of seeking status. It's not a way of just signaling commitment. It's really a way of forming ourselves to be fuller, better human beings.
Mm.
Recognizing the importance of family in that way, I think, is a start, is a beginning. And, there's no simple answer to the question of how do we deal with the sheer fact of the diversity of family forms. But even given that fact, we can see that there is such a thing as family breakdown happening
Mhm.
now. That
Mhm.
too many people are living without functional families. And that is a problem that we have to help people overcome and address and deal with. I think in the absence of that, it'd be very hard to deal with any other social problem our society faces.
Yeah, I fully agree with you there as well. Final question is, what do you think are some, I guess, practical ways? People read your book or books, and they read your pieces and all these things, and they say, well, what are the practical ways that for me as the average American, I'm not running for political office, I'm not I'm not a journalist, I'm not in higher ed or anything like that. How can I be involved in sort of reform or of institutions and be more pragmatic of how to interact with each other in
Yeah.
society?
I'd start by asking yourself, what are the couple of institutions in your life that matter most to you, that you're inclined to talk about in terms of we and us?
Mm.
Think about what those are and then ask yourself, what can I do to make those stronger and more trustworthy? And a lot of what that involves is taking the role you have in them seriously and
Mm.
saying, given the role I have here, what should I be doing? Not just what do I want, not just what do I need, but given my role, whether that's as a mother or father, whether that's as a member of this congregation, whether that's as a worker here, whether that's as a professional, given that role, what should I be doing?
Mm.
What's required of me? Asking that question of yourself a little more is really a way to make those institutions more appealing and trustworthy to other people. If you think about the people you trust in your own life, they're people who seem to ask that question implicitly.
Mm.
And if you think about the people who are really a part of the problem now in America, they're people that you look at and think, how could that person in that position have done that?
Mm.
That's a person who failed to ask that question. I think each of us needs to try, to the extent we can, to be the kind of person who succeeds in asking that question. Given the role I have here, what should I be doing?
Mm. Yeah, that's nicely said. Yuval, this has been such a delight. Everything I wanted and more. I really, really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. Thank you very much.
And I think it's important for people to get this and to learn about it. Definitely here in the U.S., but I think there's also some things. Each country is different, but even countries around the world where they have some breakdowns in institutions. So your work is tremendous, and big thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much for having me.